Continuing with this project, one of the things that I realized is, well, we were using alerts, so if I try to submit, it comes up with an alert about filling it in, colors the background red, and that's nice, but the button is still active. Some forms, the button is inactive, so it just doesn't work until you've filled out the form fields. So what I decided to do was to do a quick search of how to enable a button when all fields are filled, and of course that took me over to Stack Overflow, and on Stack Overflow I looked and saw some people were solving it using the keyUp event. And I thought, okay, well, we could add a keyUp event into it and disable a button. But, well, how do we do that? So another search then brought me over to W3 Schools and realized, oh yeah, there's the disabled property for a button. And W3 Schools is really nice because I can click on Try It Yourself. We can see that, hey, look, the button is disabled. Now if I take this, delete it, I can run it, and now we can see the button is enabled, so now it works. So we need to add that property into it. So that's one thing that we can do, and we want to tie it with the keyUp event as a way to control when the button switches to it. So we can use disabled as part of it. And I was also thinking what would be kind of nice is to set it up so that we could even, use the default, or we could just assign classes to the button itself so that it looks different. So that would be some other styling that we could do on it as well. But first, we need to figure out how we can add that attribute, because that's what that is disabled is an attribute. So how do we set and remove attributes? Well, another search of JavaScript set attribute or remove attribute brings me to the MDN website of, okay, we have set attribute and we have its companion remove attribute. Well, remove is pretty straightforward. We just put the attribute that we are trying to remove inside parentheses and inside quotes. Well, that's going to be easy enough. Adding the attribute is a little bit different, because when we choose to add it, well, the cool part is they actually chose to add an attribute for a button and add in the disabled one. Remembering that disabled doesn't have a value, it's just a standalone attribute. So it's not disabled equals true, disabled equals false. If disabled is there, it's disabled. If it's not, it's gone. Well, under set attribute, we can see when we set the disabled attribute, we provide it an empty value. Where here, if we set the name attribute, we're assigning the value. So it will say name equals hello button as part of it. But disabled is just simply disabled as it talks about in this paragraph here. All right, so that's some of the technical behind the scenes that we now know we can do. So we have to figure out how can we integrate that into our project. And this is where the fun begins. So what we can do is tell the form button, I'm sorry, not the form button. Key up and key down don't belong to individual elements, so we can assign it to our document. So if I can type correctly, document dot add event listener. The event listener will be key up. Notice it's not camel cased, it's just straight key up. And then I will create the function, so KU handler, KU short for key up. We don't need to worry about bubbling, so function KU handler And if we need to grab the event, we'll just put our E in there because we may want to do something with that later, but for now we don't really care about that. So we can check out and see if this is working. So I'm going to just log out E. Let's see what we get. So we're logging out the event on the key-up handler. So refresh the page, pull up the console so we can see what's there. So now if I go here, we can see it's logging out. So it tells me a key event is happening, the event is trusted, it tells me what key was pressed, it tells me the code, whether control key, shift, etc. was held down while it was pressed, so it's giving me that information. So that's good. So we know when a key is being pressed. So that's good with it. So that's a good first start. So we know we can capture that key up event. Now I want to do something with it. So what we want to do is we want to find out if the value of input name is not empty, and we do not, we use an exclamation mark when we are checking that. So if it's not empty, so we put in an empty string, then what we can do is we can now work on making our button enabled by removing disabled. But we haven't even put disabled on it, so we will need to do that here in just a moment. So we can assign that to it. And we don't just have one field, but we have two. So we could do this as a if, else if, and finally an else. But it really makes more sense because we only want to make the button enabled, no longer disabled, when all of the fields are filled. So when both of my fields have been filled, so we use and saying both of these situations have to be true. Name is not empty and color is not empty. So empty being represented by the two quotation marks representing an empty string. So when that is the case, then we can now enable the button. So right now, before we do that, we're just going to log this out. And now I'm going to continue with an else here, and then curly braces. Then we'll log out. Button disabled. So now, when we go back to our page here, so if I type a key, it tells me the button is disabled. Now if I go here, now the button is active because there is content in both of these. So watch, as soon as I delete the final character from here, it will then log back out. The button is disabled. If I put in a character, it's active. Delete. I'll even go and delete the first one up here under name. Now the button is disabled. Now the button is active. So the logic is working inside the code, but it's not actually doing anything. And this is where we need to do something to it. So we have two ways of making our button disabled. One is that I can just type disabled right here, save that. And now we can see, hey, look, the button is disabled and I can't click on it. So now we see that our form button is disabled. So what we want to do is when we want the button to become active, form button, and now we're going to remove the attribute, and the attribute we are going to remove is disabled. Now let's just save that and see what happens out here. So if I type a letter here, type a letter here, magic. So now that button is enabled. But if I delete up here, it still stayed active because we don't have it set. So let's go form button right here, set attribute, and the attribute is disabled. And we're going to put in an empty string. So now button's active. If I delete one, button becomes inactive. So that now is a way to prompt it to put something in each of the fields. It's not quite as obnoxious as using the alerts, which we still have coded into it, where it's checking that. And it's not a bad practice to have both methods, but we really are never getting to this alert because we can't even click the button unless these fields have been filled out with something. So this part of it is really, it's become kind of redundant or no longer in use code. So we can decide how we want to go about doing this as we put that information in to our button. Now another thing that we could do is, beyond just having it gray out, we could control that a little bit. I've made two classes here where I've set the background color and the text color, and I'm going to use this for my button so that the button is going to take on a more interesting color as part of it. So again, I could add the class up here, or I can add the class in with JavaScript. Both are perfectly acceptable. So I could go class equals inactive. And now if we take a look at it, we will see, so that's what my button looks like, and I can't click on it. So I'm kind of overriding the enabled disabled. Now also notice, when I go to the button, there's no, it doesn't switch to a hand allowing me to click on it or anything like that. So we have active and inactive. So what I want to do is right here, I can say form button dot class name equals, and the class name I want to put on it is active. See, it's kind of nice having this log statement here. If I even just put a comment or turn that into a comment just as a reminder that that's what's happening in my code here. That just does make things a little bit easier. So now we have inactive. Now if we look at this, there's my inactive button. If I put some text in there, put some text in, we can see how the button now changed its state. As soon as I delete all of it, it's gone. So this is not, this is a nice way of working with it. Now if I go here, we can see that the button has stayed in its active state. And this is part of some error checking. As soon as I get, so it's not there referencing the key up, then that happens. So what we probably need to do is in our reset, where I forgot I already had this in here. So we made the form button become disabled. Form button class name equals inactive. So now if I put stuff in, it changes to its active state. Now I thought the button would show me that we could On the mouse over event, we could switch the cursor to the hand, so we have that, but we can now see when I go back, now we're to our inactive button state. I was thinking the button gave me the hand automatically. Apparently we'll have to code that in manually if we so desire it. A quick search on how to do different cursors brings me to W3 Schools. We look at the try it again, we can see where we have the different cursors. So figuring out which one gives us the hand, if we go all the way through, we'll see that, okay, so pointer gives us the hand. So when we have a class on something where it sets the cursor to pointer, then that gives us what we need. So what we can do, a quick way, if we're going to continue with this, we can go cursor pointer. So now let's save this and see what happens. So, okay, cursor is not a pointer. Fill these in, and now cursor becomes the pointer. Now we might want to add the pointer cursor to the button here if we're going to keep the same styling. So if we set the active style on the again button, so it's there, now we go here, look, it's no longer active. So what we can do if we want, there's no reason we need our again button to be inactive, so we could just put the class on it. Class equals active. Oh, sorry, it's HTML, not JavaScript, so I have to use double quotes. Save that, see if that's working, fill it in, click, yep, there we go. So we've added in that little visual cue of the cursor setting it to the pointer. Now, this only works with pointing devices. So if you're on mobile doing something like this, you don't get the cursor because you don't have that mouse over or hover effect built into it. It only works with a mouse or other similar style pointing device. So we've now added in some more, I would argue, effective checking beyond using alerts, using the key up handler. So it's a great way of just a simple search of how do we do something. Now the sample that we came up with as we did it, we can see it did use jQuery. We're using vanilla JavaScript instead of jQuery, so that's why the syntax is a little bit different. But it provided the search, the inspiration of, oh yes, using the key up event. Well, we don't need jQuery to be able to use events because we have event listeners. When we're using jQuery, then we use event listeners a little bit differently. We use on to signify we're listening to events and then what the event is. So that's why the syntax is a little bit different. But once our search pointed us in the right direction, we were able to then very quickly implement making our buttons active or disabled and not disabled, and then provide some visual styling that we're choosing to use using some CSS to make the whole thing come together.